Multimedia Publishing Incorporated, Denver, Colorado, presents the Get Acquainted series, introducing authors and places in American literature. This unit, written by Paul Friesen, introduces Ralph Waldo Emerson. In this series of visuals, you will visit the places where Emerson lived and where he received the inspiration for his essays and poems. You will learn who Emerson was, when he lived, and how his environment influenced his ideas. You will also be introduced to the philosophy called Transcendentalism. Standing squarely and imposingly in the center of the American literary renaissance was Ralph Waldo Emerson, a thinker and teacher, a writer and lecturer, but most of all a dynamic personality, influencing not only other writers of his time, but those of all generations following. His time, the mid-19th century, was known as the Romantic era, emphasizing the wholesome influence of nature, the basic goodness of man, and the positive guiding forces of emotions and imagination. An extension of Romanticism was the philosophy known as Transcendentalism, which asserted that man has a divine spark which can control and motivate his actions. The quiet little village of Concord, Massachusetts became the center of literary discussions, for here, 20 miles west of Boston, live several important authors in American literature. Emerson's home is near Concord Center. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bronson Alcott, and his daughter, Louisa May, lived a short distance east of Emerson's house. Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and George Ripley also lived in the vicinity. The unimposing village became the home of vigorous and forceful spokesmen proclaiming new and distinctive ideas in American literary attitudes. Chief among these spokesmen was, of course, Emerson. Although he was born in Boston, he established his permanent home in Concord. Born in 1803, he was a descendant of a long line of ministers. His grandfather had settled in Concord before the Revolutionary War, and from his home, the Old Manse, he had seen the war begin at the Old North Bridge, just a short distance away. According to the inscription on this sign, the Old Manse was built in 1770 by Reverend William Emerson, grandfather of philosopher and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of Mosses from an Old Manse, lived here with his bride, Sophia, from 1842 to 1845. Except for this brief period, the Old Manse was occupied by Mrs. William Emerson and her descendants for 169 years. Emerson's father, the pastor of the First Unitarian Church of Boston, died in 1811, leaving the family destitute. Emerson, his mother, 3 brothers, and 1 sister were invited by Emerson's step-grandfather, Reverend Ezra Ripley, to move into the Old Manse. They lived there for about a year before returning to Boston, where Mrs. Emerson courageously worked to provide a home and an education for her children. Emerson graduated from Harvard in 1821 at the age of 18. Between his graduation from Harvard and his return to permanent residency in Concord, he attended Harvard Divinity School, became the pastor of the Second Unitarian Church of Boston, married Ellen Tucker, who died a year and a half later, resigned the pastorate, traveled to Europe, returned to America, and began giving public lectures. In 1835, he was again living in the Old Manse when, on a lecture tour to Plymouth, he met Lydia Jackson. They were engaged in June of 1835, but waited to get married until he could find a permanent home. Meanwhile, he remained at the Old Manse, where he began writing his first book, Nature. It was published a year later. The book contains his view that nature is a physical yet spiritual power which has the ability to calm and heal the spirit of man. The book, Nature, expressing his philosophic idealism, became the textbook of the Transcendentalists. In August of 1835, he purchased this home. In his journals, he wrote, I bought my house and 2 acres, 6 rods of land of John T. Coolidge for $3,500. In his journal entry of September 14, 1835, he recorded simply, "I was married to Lydia Jackson." This beautiful 2-story home was Emerson's residence from 1835 until his death in 1882. It became a central meeting place for the literary-minded people of Concord. Here, Emerson lived comfortably. From his first wife's estate and from his lectures, he received enough income to support his family, plus 2 maids and a gardener. His lecturing extended over a period of 40 years, taking him from Europe to California. Lecturing was the nearest thing to a profession which he ever had. He was popular, as revealed by James Russell Lowell in his essay, Emerson the Lecturer. Mr. Emerson is the most steadily attractive lecturer in America. The charm of his voice, his manner, and his matter has never lost its power over his hearers. What they do not fully understand, they take on trust and listen. Lowell concluded, "We do not go to hear what Emerson says, so much as to hear Emerson." While people were fascinated with him as a lecturer, he was fascinated with the abundance of beauty in nature. In a poem entitled "The Rhodora," written in honor of a lone flower in the woods, he exclaimed, "Rhodora, if the sages ask thee why this charm is wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being." The house was not entirely satisfactory to Emerson's tastes for beauty at the time he bought it, but he saw possibilities for improvement. He believed, as he stated, the outside of it could not be fine until trees and flowers gave it a character of its own. The house was carefully decorated, partially remodeled, and beautifully furnished by the Emersons. It still stands today as a tribute to Emerson's decorative tastes and his love for books. One complete wall of the study is lined with books in keeping with the statement in his journals. "I am filling my house with books which I am bound to read, and wondering whether the new heavens which await the soul will allow consultation of these." His library spilled over into his parlor, where he received and entertained guests. He resolved, even before buying the house, to crowd so many books and papers and, if possible, wise friends into it, that it shall have as much wit as it can carry. As a result, guests were numerous, and bookshelves were mounted in almost every room. His overnight guests had their own quarters in this lovely upstairs bedroom, overlooking the spacious yard. Emerson labeled it the Pilgrim's Room. Although in his first years of marriage his finances were not abundant, he approved his wife's determination to give our many visitors only things comfortable, dispensing with luxury and show. Company will be but small additional expense if we keep but the same decent table that we hope to afford at all times. The master bedroom was called the Blue Room. The 4-poster bed, the blue rocker, and the rich blue velvet drapes show Emerson's love for elegance. The small bookshelf above a small study desk enhances further Emerson's desire for continual contact with literary minds and topics. A special room at the top of the stairs was furnished for Emerson's friend, Henry David Thoreau, who often invited himself to dine at Emerson's table and to stay overnight. While Emerson was gone for about 2 years on his second trip to Europe, Thoreau lived here, taking care of the family and of the yard. In one letter to Emerson, Thoreau explained, "I have banked up the young trees against the winter and the mice, and I will look out in my careless way to see when a pail is loose or a nail drops out of its place. I heartily wish I could be of good service to this household. But I, who have only used these 10 digits so long to solve the problem of living, how can I? The world is a cow that is hard to milk." Although Emerson chose to spend his time reading and writing, he also loved the hard work and the closeness to nature which his small farm offered. The stable and carriage house, a woodlot and garden, plus a few animals, constituted his farm. He planted many trees and shrubs. His special joy was his garden, where he spent many hours. His garden was a source of food, but probably more than that, it was a source of mental and physical relief. It provided good exercise during a time when he was suffering from a lung inflammation. It also provided a release of emotions in times of frustration. When upset over too much company or too much study, he would take his hoe and work furiously. He admitted, "I confess I work at first with a little venom, lay to a little unnecessary strength. But by smoothing the rough hillocks, I smooth my temper." In the garden and in the woods, he found peace and contentment. The woods surrounding Walden Pond became a favorite retreat for him. Here he enjoyed solitude, or on occasion he took walks with Hawthorne and others, discussing the new thinking called transcendentalism. In order to gain a firmer hold on a permanent retreat, in September of 1844, he purchased a tract of land on the north shore of Walden Pond. Emerson was drawn to the inviting quietness of Walden, where he could meditate on his beliefs in the dignity of man and the moral goodness inherent in an individual. He once stated, "I like man, but not men." In the essay Self-Reliance, he wrote, "Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members." He believed that the highest revelation is that God is in every man. Therefore, if a man becomes acquainted with himself and trusts himself, he will learn to recognize the power and integrity of his own mind. Emerson was dismayed that American writers and thinkers still clung to European ideas. He tried to encourage his fellow Americans to assert their individuality, to think their own thoughts. In Self-Reliance, he stated, "To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius." Emerson's influence was strong in Concord. Fellow thinkers and writers came to his home to discuss philosophical viewpoints. They read his essays in The Dial, a periodical which Emerson edited for 2 years. The Dial was the official publication of the Transcendentalists. Bronson Alcott was an original thinker who searched for the origin and meaning of abstractions such as truth and life. He was a frequent visitor in Emerson's home. However, the association between the two was not always pleasant for Emerson. Once, after Alcott had spent 3 days with him, Emerson wrote in his journals, "He is, to be sure, monotonous. You may say one gets tired of the uniformity. He will not be amused, but always truth and its origin he seeketh after." Later, Emerson wrote, "Alcott sees the law of man truer than anyone ever did." Unhappily, his conversation never loses sight of his own personality. His topic yesterday is Alcott on the 17th October, today Alcott on the 18th October, tomorrow on the 19th. So will it be always. I do not want any more such persons to exist. In general, he admired Alcott and even helped him financially on occasion. Another close friend, whose residence, the Wayside, stood next to the Orchard House, was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Emerson enjoyed Hawthorne's company, even though Hawthorne never embraced transcendental idealism. They often went on lengthy walking tours, discussing current issues and ideas. After one walking tour, Emerson recorded in his journals, "Our walk had no incidents. It needed none, for we were in excellent spirits and had much conversation." After Hawthorne's death, Emerson wrote, "It was easy to talk to him. Only he said so little that I talked too much." Emerson's closest associate was Henry David Thoreau. Perhaps this was true because Thoreau never married and never entangled himself with financial obligations. In Thoreau, Emerson saw his theories put to practice. He said, "Thoreau gives me, in flesh and blood, my own ethics. He is far more real and daily practically obeying them than I." When Thoreau was put into jail for refusing to pay his poll tax, Emerson visited him. According to tradition in Concord, Emerson asked, "Henry, why are you in there?" Thoreau answered, "Waldo, why aren't you in here?" Both Emerson and Thoreau were interested in governmental systems. Emerson's concerns inspired him to become involved in civic and social affairs in Concord. Both men, believing in the inherent worth and dignity of each individual, supported abolitionist efforts. Both believed in the potential for universal freedom, a basic right which had been won in a national sense by the Revolutionary War soldiers. When the granite monument was erected in 1836 on the east shore of the Concord River, Emerson was called upon to write a poem commemorating the bravery of the American farmers who withstood the attack of the British soldiers at the Old North Bridge. On the base of the granite obelisk, the legend describes the original scene. Here, on the 19th of April, 1775, was made the first forcible resistance to British aggression. On the opposite bank stood the American militia. Here stood the invading army, and on this spot the first of the enemy fell in the war of that revolution, which gave independence to these United States. At the dedication ceremonies on July 4, 1837, Emerson's poem, later known as the Concord Hymn, was sung to the tune of Old Hundred. The first stanza was engraved in the base of the Minuteman statue erected 38 years later on the 100th anniversary of the opening battle. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The poem continues in a tribute to the brave soldiers who fought and died, with a plea for the remembrance of their sacrifices. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silence sleeps. And time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank by this soft stream, we set today a votive stone. The memory may their deed redeem, when, like our sires, our sons are gone, spirits that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free. Bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raised to them and thee. The violence that occurred here stood in marked contrast to the peacefulness of the river and the green meadows and woods. As a youngster living in the nearby Old Manse, Emerson had played here. Later, in memory of his brothers, Edward and Charles, Emerson wrote, "The winding Concord gleam below, pouring as wide a flood as when my brothers long ago came with me to the wood. They took this valley for their toy. They played with it in every mood. A cell for prayer, a hall for joy. They treated nature as they would." In 1875, the Minuteman statue was placed on the opposite side of the river from the obelisk. Emerson was chosen to deliver the dedicatory address for this monument, on which the first stanza of his Concord Hymn was engraved. The bronze sculpture of the Minuteman with his gun and his plow was the work of Daniel Chester French, who later carved a bust of Emerson. The day of the unveiling of this monument, April 19, 1875, was a raw, blustery winter day, but hundreds came out to hear Emerson's simple account of the battle and its significance for future generations. The large audience attested to Emerson's popularity in the community. His popularity in Concord was also evident when 3 years before, in 1872, his house was partially destroyed by fire. Neighbors quickly came to the rescue, removing furniture, books, food, and many valuables, and finally putting out the fire. Emerson once more moved to the Old Manse until his house could be rebuilt, a job quickly accomplished with the aid of more than $17,000 donated to him. Friends urged Emerson, now in poor health, to take a trip to Europe while his house was being rebuilt, strengthening their persuasion by paying for his expenses. He left soon, accompanied by his daughter, Ellen. During the European trip, his health continued to fail. He returned to America the day after his 70th birthday. Upon arriving at the train station in Concord, he was greeted by a band and almost the entire town. In parade fashion, they marched to his house, where in quiet humility he addressed them. "My friends, I know that this is not a tribute to an old man and his daughter returned to their house, but to the common blood of us all, one family in Concord." During his remaining 9 years in Concord, his popularity increased, but his health diminished. He died of pneumonia on April 27, 1882, and was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. His daughter, Ellen Tucker Emerson, named after his first wife, is buried on one side of his grave. When she was born, he wrote in his journals, "Lydian, who magnanimously makes my gods her gods, calls the babe Ellen." I can hardly ask more for thee, my babe, than that name implies. Ellen never married, but became rather a companion and secretary for her father. On the other side is the grave of Lydian, with whom he shared 47 years of happy marriage. Shortly after their marriage, Emerson changed her first name from Lydia to Lydian, because he disliked the final R sound which New Englanders attached to the name Lydia. She died 10 years after his death, having been both a loving companion and an ardent admirer of her husband. Emerson's life spanned almost the entire 19th century. He was born when the third president, Thomas Jefferson, was in office. He died when Chester Alan Arthur was the 21st president. Emerson saw the beginning of Native American literature in Irving's and Cooper's works. He did most of his writing during the Romantic period, along with Hawthorne, Melville, Thoreau, Longfellow, Whittier, and others. And he saw the trend toward naturalism during the closing years of the 19th century. Few authors have achieved the literary stature which Emerson attained. At the time of his death, funeral eulogies and memorial essays were written in abundance. To the end, he embraced the transcendental ideals of man's inherent divinity and resisted formalism and external control. The large, rough-hewn quartz headstone which distinguishes his resting place bears out his philosophy of individualism and nonconformity.